video, as I mentioned in the last one, we're going to talk about Winnie Dunn's sensory processing model. Winnie Dunn was a student of Jean Ayres, so this model is heavily based off of sensory integration and has a lot of the same components but some different terms. So sensory processing is defined as the way that the nervous system receives sensory messages and turns them into responses. So the way that this term is different from sensory integration is that it includes the responses within the term. So sensory processing is a bit of an umbrella term that sensory integration is a part of, and then the processing has that response piece as well. So they view the dysfunction of sensory processing in a very similar way, but sensory integration theory categorizes sensory processing types into 4 specific patterns, and we're going to talk about in the next slide. The theory overall identifies each person's reactions to daily sensory events. So the 2 components in these 4 sensory types are threshold and response. So you can have a high or low threshold and then a passive or active response. And similar to sensory integration, this will vary by sense, and it includes those same 7 senses that we talked about in the last video. So these are the 4 main patterns are the circles, the low registration, sensory sensitive, sensation seeking, and sensation avoiding. We'll first talk about the threshold, which we briefly touched on the last slide. The threshold is defined as somebody's personal range for noticing and responding to different sensory events. So you see that a high neurological threshold is a hyposensitivity, and then a low threshold is a hypersensitivity. So if you're hyposensitive, then you won't notice it as much. So that threshold is high because the threshold is where it crosses over into you noticing it. So then if you have a low threshold to a certain sense, then you're hypersensitive. So for example, if you're hypersensitive to tactile sensations such as rough clothing, then you have a low neurological threshold for that tactile sense. So a low sensory threshold, you're going to notice and respond to stimuli more often because the neurological system activates easier and more readily to those sensory events. And then a high sensory threshold, the neurological system requires stronger stimuli to activate, so you may miss stimuli that others notice easily. And then again, with similar to what I mentioned in the last video, it's not super important to understand all the specifics of this theory. It's just good kind of background knowledge to help you look further into why certain behaviors or difficulties are happening so that you can provide those supports. So then self-regulation is defined as somebody's active or passive response to the excess or lack of sensory stimulation. So if you have passive self-regulation, then the person will remain in the situation and just become uncomfortable and frustrated or distracted. So if you have passive self-regulation to rough clothing, then you just leave it on, but you're uncomfortable and frustrated and maybe very irritable, but aren't necessarily going to act on that. So then active self-regulation, the person would adjust their position to get a more manageable amount of sensory input. So in that same example, they would be taking off that clothing or refusing to put it on. In the example of auditory input, if they are actively self-regulating to a lack or excess of noise, you may see somebody humming or whistling or moving to a different room. So those are the 4 main, those are the threshold and self-regulation. Then next we're going to talk more specifically about the 4 main types. So the first 2 we'll talk about are low registration and sensory seeking. So low registration, you're going to be hyposensitive or have a high threshold and passively self-regulate. So what this would look like is the person does not recognize or process all incoming sensory information and does not compensate by seeking sensory input. So they're not noticing many things and they're not really going to do much to seek it out, so they may appear uninterested or inattentive. A sensory seeking category has a high neurological threshold, but actively self-regulates. So for each of these examples, if for the example of auditory input, someone with low registration isn't getting the auditory input, but isn't going to seek it out. So in the example of in a classroom setting, if the auditory input of the teacher is not enough, then they are just going to have a lot of difficulty paying attention, but aren't going to compensate for it. And somebody that's sensory seeking in that same situation, they would compensate by seeking sensory input. So they may appear hyperactive in that situation and engage in unsafe activities. So in the same auditory example, they may begin making noise themselves by humming or whistling, or by throwing objects against the wall, knocking things down, just to get that auditory input. The final two senses, somebody that is sensory sensitive is hypersensitive or has a low threshold, and then passively self-regulates. So they may feel very overwhelmed by sensory information, but rather than avoiding that overstimulation, they're going to become frustrated, distracted, irritable, and very uncomfortable. In somebody that is sensory avoiding, they also have that same low threshold, but they would actively self-regulate. So in the case that they're overwhelmed, they may run away from a noisy environment, cover their ears, avoid touching certain materials, and so on. So in that example that we talked about earlier with the scratchy clothing, if they're sensory avoiding, this is where they're going to refuse putting it on or take it off, or they just have that lower threshold, so they can get overstimulated more easily as well. So a lot of what you're going to do when considering this is very similar to how you would apply the sensory integration model. So you just really want to make sure that you're considering the sensory demands of each activity and environment and how that is affecting a certain child's participation or their engagement. So you really want to look out for and try different things to see what's bothering them, see what works to help them feel as comfortable as possible. And then some of those sensory tools we talked about again is having a calming zone, noise makers, lava lamps, fidget tools, wiggle seat, weighted vest, and more. So these are just both good to understand the basic concepts of, not necessarily the details, so that you can provide those supports as we said before. And a lot of this plays into behavior, as I mentioned. So the next video, we're going to talk a bit more about behavior management, and these are good concepts to keep in mind as you're going through that learning as well.